Good evening, and thank you for joining us. It's my great pleasure to be here in conversation with Karen this evening. Karen's book, Brick by Brick, weaves together three major elements of Karen's life: the challenges of maintaining healthy familial relationships while working in international development, insights about her upbringing, and how it has personally driven her, and most of all, the women she has met in her work and the mutual impact that they've had on each other. So, Karen, welcome.
Thank you so much.
Delighted to have you. So let's begin by discussing, before we get deep into the content of the book, could you tell us a bit about the nature of the work that you've done over the years and what it's involved and where has it taken you?
Sure. Good evening. Good evening, everyone. So I've been in the field of international development for about 30 years now. I spent 15 years working throughout the former Soviet Union, Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, the Caucasus, Central Asia, mostly helping women transition from the planned to a market economy. After the Soviet Union collapsed, there really was a massive disruption economically, and it was women I had found who were willing to pick up the pieces and rebuild their lives and really to start small businesses. And from that experience, I spent 10 years working with women survivors of war and conflict and post-conflict zones around the world. All the great places that you hear about in the news all the time, Afghanistan, Iraq, South Sudan, Congo, really some of the worst places on earth to be a woman. And then for the last 6 years, I've been the president of the Akilah Institute, which is Rwanda's first and only women's college.
Great, thank you. An amazing career. And, one thing I want to ask you, particularly the work that you've done in these war zones, how do you deal with reverse culture shock? How do you manage mentally and emotionally to switch back between an affluent suburban life in D.C. To, the brutality and poverty of the places that you've worked?
Yeah. If I'm being really honest, not always very well. I live in Bethesda, Maryland with family and 3 sons, but, I'm often going back and forth to conflict zones. And so just looking at the way that women are treated in a lot of these countries, in a place like South Sudan, for example, where women are really valued beneath animals. Or in Bosnia, for example, where women were used and discarded as weapons of war, and then I'm back in Bethesda, and then I'm in Afghanistan, and I'm in Congo. And so it was hard to reconcile those worlds, and really this life of privilege and abundance that, we shared. And so it was a challenge, but I also wanted to give my kids this experience themselves, which is one of the reasons that I wanted to bring them to Rwanda.
Great, and that segs into my next question about the book, and it covers a lot of ground, but it's framed by the year that you made a significant decision for your family and your career when you decided that you were going to move with your 3 sons and your husband to visit periodically to Rwanda for a year. By any measure, that was a pretty bold and unique choice.
Some say crazy.
Well, I wouldn't go there, but can you talk about why Rwanda and talk about all of the factors that went into making that decision?
Sure. I think I'll start with sort of the catalyst for the move, which was really, I had applied for the CEO job at Women for Women International and didn't get it, and was really just devastated probably than one really should be if one doesn't get a job. It was, the work felt so personal to me. These are women who had really lost everything. A lot of them had lost their husbands and their children and their livelihoods and had experienced atrocities on a scale many of us couldn't even imagine. And what I loved about the organization, which still resonates with me today, is they never thought of or treated these women as victims, women who were helpless or women to be pitied. They were really treated always as potential agents of change, women who were capable of transforming their lives and in turn the lives of their families and communities. And that message that, women are inherently capable and powerful, regardless of circumstances, really resonated with me. And so it kind of, the lost job really sent me into a bit of a tailspin, and I started questioning a lot of things about my marriage, my career, what came next, what did it mean? And I think maybe a midlife crisis, if you will, but I started to think to get myself to a better place, I might actually need to live in a different place. And I wanted to take my 3 boys with me. And sort of the why Rwanda, which is the second part of this question. I really did a calculus in terms of where could I actually live with the 3 boys, and most of those places were off the table from a security standpoint. I was like, Iraq, no. Afghanistan, no. Congo. So it came down to really Bosnia and Rwanda, and I chose Rwanda. And are you all familiar with the story of Rwanda? A bit of the history that in 1994 they had a tragic genocide, the swiftest genocide in history, where close to 1 million people were brutally murdered over 100 days of violence, and upwards of 300,000 women were sexually violated and tortured in the genocide, really used as weapons of war. But the story of Rwanda doesn't start or end with the genocide, of course, and since then the country has really developed and thrived. It has one of the fastest growing economies in East Africa and really serves today as a model for human development across the region. And most importantly at the time, it was safe.
And a couple things came to mind as I was listening to your answer. That old adage, for every door that closes, another one opens. And with Rwanda in particular, one of the things that is remarkable about its recovery is that it's the women of Rwanda who've brought it back from the brink. And in terms of their political participation, women are very much a part of running the country, and so it's a wonderful place, I think.
It's a really important point. I mean, after the genocide, the population actually became 70% female because so many men died or were incarcerated during the genocide or post-genocide that women really had no choice but to get involved in rebuilding their countries and their families and the society. They also had a president who was committed to putting women forward politically, economically, socially, and otherwise, and that has really propelled women forward. But more broadly, what I have seen in different country contexts is, you talked about the silver lining, that war and conflict sometimes does create a window of opportunity for women to renegotiate their rights and roles in society because things have changed, the status quo has changed, and for Rwanda, that was certainly the case.
Absolutely. The other thing that I marveled about in reading Karen's book is your command and control, your logistics acumen. Can you share some of the details of what you had to put in or set in place to make life work for you and your sons in Rwanda? I mean, it's incredibly daunting. Sometimes I just have problems getting myself out of the house. So just thinking of someone who is transplanting 3 sons, setting up life in a new place. Tell us how you were able to do that, and what was different for you that year with the family there?
Well, I hadn't really thought through the implications of actually living in Rwanda. It was like, I want to go to Rwanda. But I realized once I got there, I was like, okay, I'm still doing my job. I'm still traveling back and forth to Congo and South Sudan. I have the 3 boys. Who's going to watch the boys when I actually leave the country? So there was a lot of scrambling as that goes. But one of the things I did was like, I need help. And so basically I gave, in my executive management speak, I gave each guy a scope of work with a set of key deliverables and have put them in charge of different aspects of the house. I brought them into my life in a way that I wouldn't have otherwise. Because the family was so far away, my kids were so far away, and I was going back and forth, and my husband was watching the kids a lot of the time when I was traveling. it's really easy to compartmentalize your life. You're in the field, you're working, you're doing your job, they're over there, they're well cared for, but that they were right here. And so there's a scene in the book where I'm going to Congo. I had just crossed the border. I had some pretty serious management issues that I was dealing with, and all three kids that called me and said, "We're sick, we have the flu, come home." And it was just, one of those moments where I couldn't come home. And obviously, we had some help to, work with and check on the boys, but it just, they were right there. And also when I was going back and forth to South Sudan, we had a critical situation there. People's lives were on the line. We had to extricate our entire staff from South Sudan, and I couldn't just leave that at the office. It was impossible. And so, it broke down a lot of those barriers that I had built up in terms of keeping the work and family life separate. And for those of you who are parents in the room, you can appreciate this, but there's a moment when in your kids, when you stop thinking of them as kids and start thinking of them as like people. And I really brought them into my life as people, and they brought me in a different way too.
That's great. And for someone who works in women's empowerment and girls' empowerment education, thank you for raising three incredible feminist boys. So well done. And, Karen, as you began at the beginning of our conversation, you've worked in some of the most stressful, horrific places, really, on the planet. And at any point in your career, you could have written a book, several books, about your experiences. What was it about your time in Rwanda that made it feel more urgent to reflect and write about it?
Well, a couple of things. One is that, I had always collected women's stories as part of my job. That was part of, when you do international development, you do data collection, monitoring, and evaluation. And so I had notebooks full of those stories. But, I was really a development professional doing my job. But there was something about being in Rwanda and going through my own journey, my personal journey, and everything that was coming up for me. I started to think about story collection in a different way. I started thinking, I'm talking to these women. I'm learning about their perspectives and their choices as I was trying to consider my own choices, some choices that I really needed to make. The other piece that it really brought up for me is there were some things that I hadn't really dealt with from my childhood in terms of my past. And, my father was abusive verbally and otherwise, physically to my mother and also to my siblings and me. And I think I had sort of not really dealt with that in a way. You're on a career path, you're moving forward, you're successful, you think, well, I'm kind of past it. But as other women are sharing their stories with me, I started to think about my mother and how my father would berate her incessantly and belittle her for all her inadequacies. And she was really the target of everything that was wrong with his life, his financial concerns for his business, his frustrations working for his harsh and condemning father. And I remember thinking, why would she put up with such indignity? Why would she stay in a marriage that clearly wasn't working? Where was her voice? And then I asked her about that much, much later, and she said, where was I going to go with 3 children and no money of my own? I couldn't go home to my mother. She said, I had no choice. And I was interviewing a woman in Rwanda, a woman by the name of Euphrasia, and I had met her before too, and we were sitting down having a conversation, and this is a woman whose husband had beat her all the time. He beat her so hard that she ended up having a miscarriage with her first child. And he used to monitor the amount of food she ate because she didn't contribute financially. And so I asked her this question about why she stayed with him. And she said, where am I going to go with these 5 children, no money of my own? She said, I had no choice. And I don't know why, but you'd think, because I'd heard so many stories, but I started to connect the dots when we were there, and it was like the pattern of what women had experienced again and again that I had heard. And it was really through those survivors that I understood my mother's missing voice and her lack of choice.
Yeah, so it really was bringing those two experiences together.
That's right.
That made you want to focus on that. So, the book is full of harrowing yet remarkable stories of women survivors like Christina, Safita, Grace, and Teresa. Share another story with us about these remarkable women that you worked with there.
Teresa was one of the women. She had been through the Women for Women program. So she is a young woman who was forced to drop out of school at the age of 16 when her father passed away after the genocide. And, her mother was left to support her and her 10 siblings. Often the family went hungry. And so she did what a lot of young women do at that time, is she got married to a neighbor and ended up having 5 children in quick succession. And she depended on her husband really for everything. He wouldn't really give her permission to leave the house. And so she would be growing crops, but she wasn't allowed to go to the market to sell them. And she describes herself, I was the type of woman who just lives in the house. So she finally convinces her husband to be allowed to join the Women for Women program, and through that she gets training in agriculture and she meets other women, and she hears about them starting their own businesses and they're encouraging her. So then she starts a couple of businesses. She starts a small banana plantation. She starts buying and selling cows in the market. She starts a couple of fish ponds. And then she decides to buy a bar and a restaurant in the town center. All of a sudden, her businesses are making a profit. She buys land and she builds a house for her family. And they have enough left over to buy a new television set and a generator. And her neighbors are kind of like, what's going on? She said, my neighbors used to say demonic things about me, that I am not peaceful. They were not used to seeing a woman making money or taking a moto to the marketplace. But she said, I showed them by showing them all the things I'm doing. So instead of getting angry, she shows all of her neighbors how to start their own small income generation projects. And so she is putting all of her kids through school. Her daughters are in a private day school. Other kids are in a government school. And every Saturday, she goes to the market to sell. And she really wants them to be able to earn an income as well as finish their education. But it's just an example of a woman who's gaining voice and choice through income generation.
Wow. Let's applaud her in absentia. That's amazing. That sense of resiliency that we see over and over in the book. Also in the book, you lay bare your own story of growing up in an abusive home and how it shaped you. And really, the difficulty in straddling the developing and developed world and keeping a marriage going, in addition to being a good mother. You've literally walked alongside women in a variety of contexts and cultures. What is it that you've observed and concluded about the power of sharing stories?
I think, even today we're hearing about Me Too and the Harvey Weinstein, and that's just really what I have observed being the tip of the iceberg here. But, a lot of women are carrying these stories inside of them and have not had an opportunity to share them. I know that for some of the women in Congo that we used to work with, and that was actually our largest program. For some of you who don't know, over 2 million women were raped over the country's protracted war. Some of those women who came through the women program were so traumatized they couldn't even say their names out loud. And so what we would do is we would put them into groups of 25 for training, but more than that, for that sense of connection to other women, a number of whom had never shared their stories before. And just to create a safe space for women to be able to tell their stories for the first time, to be able to count on that social network among other women was really in some ways even more valuable than the training itself. And I'd seen that over and over again. But, this book really was the first time that I'd shared my story. I had never put it down. I just, kept it all inside. So this was a chance to share my story alongside these other women who'd, for me, they had shared the most raw and intimate details of their stories with me. And what I felt about my own story was that it felt disingenuous to be able to share their stories and not put my own story on the page in a genuine way.
And I suspect that you've been embraced, and it's been a safe journey to be able to share your story as well. Would that be true?
Yeah, you write a book and you never know what the reaction's going to be, but I have been hugely gratified by the feedback that I've gotten particularly from so many women about sharing an honest story in a way that they can connect to it, and maybe even learn something about what connects us all as women, even if we think we might not have anything in common with Afghan women or Congolese women or South Sudanese women. I have found that there's a universality in the women's story in so many different ways. And lest we think that, the 1 in 3 women being victims of violence is happening over there, what I've told so many of my American audiences is that, 1 in 16 American women experience rape as their first sexual encounter. I think that's a startling statistic.
From Women for Women International to Akilah, you've shifted your focus somewhat over what types of education and training have real impact. I mean, one of the things that stood out from the story that you were telling about the first person in Rwanda is it was that knowledge, it was education. And can you tell us how your thinking has evolved over time, and what is it that really moves the needle for stable communities, and about the best way to empower women, and how does that impact us here in the U.S. as well?
Yeah, I don't think it's changed so much as it's refined a little bit. I mean, what we used to say at Women for Women is access to knowledge plus access to resources creates lasting change, and ultimately women-led community change. At Akilah, and really through my own experience, not just with Akilah, but with women more broadly, is when women have access to an education and access to income, it creates voice and choices for women. And actually what I have found is that education is insufficient to really move the dial for women and girls long term, because education gives women voice, but it's really the income piece that gives women choice. And I've seen that play out everywhere. The story I just told you about my mother in Euphrasia, about the income piece giving women choice. And I think that is true to this day. What I love about the Akilah model as a women's college was that it doesn't just say we're going to help underserved women gain access to an education, but really looking at the marketplace and understanding what those market opportunities are for women and men, and working backwards to make sure that when those young women graduate, they're able to launch their careers in the marketplace. And it's working. 86% of the Akilah graduates, one of whom is in the room today, Nadine behind you.
Hey, Nadine. Stand up. Get your applause. Thank you.
86% of Akilah graduates secure jobs within 6 months of graduation and earn incomes up to 11 times the national median income. But here's the most amazing thing. 81% are paying for health care or school fees for other family members. So they're bringing their whole families along. And when I think of the Akilah young women, I think of them as kind of the daughters of the Women for Women women.
That's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. Also, Aquila is part of the Davis College. Can you explain for folks what that's about?
So Aquila's celebrating its 10th anniversary right now. 2020 was founded in 2010. And there's been a lot of demand from young men, like, why can't we go to Aquila? And I think we have resisted doing that because we wanted to make sure that we had a women's only space for them. But there's so much research that says engaging men around gender equity is just as important as engaging women. And so because of that, as well as some other reasons, we launched Davis College just this past year to have a co-ed opportunity alongside the women's only. So women will be able to choose whether they want to go to a co-ed college or go to a single-sex college. And frankly, we used to hear that at Women for Women all the time. It's great that you're training us, but frankly, if you're not training our husbands, our brothers, our uncles, our cousins, then you're not really moving the dial around these issues. And for that reason, Women for Women started a men's leadership program.
That's great. What's your vision for the future of education globally? Should we be thinking differently about what constitutes education here?
I think so. I think it's a luxury to just have an education that doesn't really link up to the future of work. And I think the workplace is changing so dramatically now with technology, climate change, as well as other shifts in the global economy. And I think we need to be thinking about that from an education standpoint, just to move it beyond sort of the American context. But if you think about there being 1 billion youth by 2050 on the African continent, 1 billion youth. And if we're not able to address not only their education and employment, it could be a real crisis. Yeah. And so I think it isn't just education, it's the education that links to workforce, but also thinking about it from a women's perspective too. There are already significant barriers to women's education, certainly throughout Africa and Asia and many other countries. And so we have a potential challenge in terms of taking care of their future education employment if we don't actively work to close access, skill, and technology gaps for young women. I know you see that through your work too at Career Girls, and showing young women a different way to engage or think about their future career potential is just so important.
Yes, thank you for that. I mean, for us, it's all about closing the imagination gap for what's possible. So we're very much aligned in the work that we do. We've been collecting some of your questions, and I'd like to bring them into our conversation now. This first one is, U.S. interventions in developing nations, though well-intentioned, can sometimes be more negative than positive. Why do you think it's important to consider that we ensure foreign aid actually serves the people that it intends to long term?
That is such a good question. I've seen international development go bad on so many different levels, and particularly U.S. government-led interventions. And there's nothing that breaks my heart more like driving through South Sudan and seeing yet another defunct aid project that is not sustainable, that is not rooted in the community, that is not locally led. And it too often happens that, international development becomes a pipeline for moving money and serving American interests as opposed to the interests of what's really needed on the ground. Actually, one of the reasons I joined Women for Women was they hired local nationals to run all of their country offices and pretty much all of their staff. They took no more than 10% in terms of government money so that they could control what they were doing and how they would do development, their approach to development. I had worked with an organization before that was like 95% U.S. government driven or USAID funded, and I didn't want that anymore. Aquila doesn't take government money. We don't even take Rwandan government money because we want to be able to have ownership over the curriculum that we deliver to students and feel that we're doing it in the way that we think is most impactful for the women and now men on the ground.
You've touched on the work of Akilah. Can you give more of the background for people in the audience that don't know when you were established and
Sure.
more of your stats?
So it really started in 2010 because of the dearth of higher education options for young women. And still, even in Rwanda, you have tertiary education numbers in the single digits for women. Actually, the secondary school graduation rates in Rwanda are around 14%. So it's a work in progress. The government is prioritizing education, but it's going to take a while for them to catch up. And so we really looked at what needed to be done and set up the Akilah Institute to address that problem, essentially. And it is a whole education to workforce model. So we looked at the market, saw where there's opportunities, and so these women are going through a 2-year diploma program linked to some of the fastest growing sectors of the economy. Hospitality management, small business management and entrepreneurship, and information systems. And information systems was a totally, I know you do a lot of STEM work and modeling for young women, but information systems was a totally non-traditional area for young women. In fact, if there were even computers in the classroom, there was usually one, and the girls never got to touch them at all. And we'd hear that all the time. And you'd also hear that, parents and teachers were discouraging young women for, technology is a boys' thing. You don't want them to do that. So when we launched an information systems major in 2014, we had 8 brave young women apply to that particular program. But those young women got some pretty kick-ass jobs, and because of that, that program has grown and grown over the years, and so there's hundreds of young women in that program.
Well, that's wonderful. Congratulations. So this next question from the audience is there anything we can do here in the U.S. to enhance the voices of women around the world, to help women who've experienced trauma in war-torn or transitioning countries? What can we do?
I think creating forums like this where you're able to hear, hopefully not just from me, but for other women as well, making opportunities available for them to talk about lessons across borders. I still see a lot of stovepiping going on between sort of women and girls issues domestically and women and girls issues internationally. And I don't know why that is, because there's so much that connects those stories up. So really looking at those opportunities across borders and creating those opportunities. And also, what I would say is getting involved too. It doesn't take a huge amount of money or time to make a difference in somebody's life overseas. If you think about, to come to Akilah, for example, it's $3,000. Students pay between $850 and $900 a year, but it costs to serve about $3,000 or $6,000 over 2 years to get a life-changing education. That's not for everybody, but it's not a huge ticket item to make a difference in those young women's lives.
Oh yeah, and especially when you think about the multiplier effect that you were talking about in your previous example. They not only are advancing and enhancing the quality of life for themselves individually, but paying those school fees, paying those medical fees for their family is incredible. Now going back again to Rwanda, can you talk about, this question is there a difference in the condition, I think this person is saying, between Hutu and Tutsi women, past and present? What's going on now ethnically with those groups?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, we don't really talk about sort of the distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi, and that was done very, very intentionally post-genocide. The government has been really committed to building a unified Rwanda where people are not sort of defined by their national identity other than being a Rwandan. I'm not saying that people don't know, but it's just we don't talk about it. And so, when I was in the office, it wasn't something that we looked at. And so I know at Aquila there are women of all different nationalities there. We have women who wear headscarves. We have, I'm sure, all different ethnicities there. And so I think they've done a really good job of making sure that ethnicity is mainstreamed, if you will, both at a government level, in the workplace, intermarriage, etc., with this idea of building a unified country.
And let's talk a little bit more about reconciliation. One of the passages that I remember very vividly in reading the book was your experience visiting the Rwandan Genocide Memorial. You live in D.C. You've also been to the Holocaust Memorial there. Can you share the experience and juxtapose the two for us?
I mean, if you think about the genocide being about 26 years ago, it's really just a blip in history. And so, Genocide Memorial Month is a sacred period within Rwanda. And so every year, the genocide started on April 7th and concluded on July 4th. They call that Liberation Day. And so really over that period of time, people give testimonials about what happened during the genocide. They share their stories. Oftentimes there are situations where bodies that were still uncovered or not identified during the genocide or post-genocide, perpetrators will tell where some of those bodies are buried, and so they bring that to the fore, and just a lot of conversations around reconciliation. And the Kigali Genocide Memorial does a really beautiful job, I think, of telling the story not just of the genocide in Rwanda, but of other genocides as well. There's a whole room there devoted to what happened in Armenia, what happened during the Holocaust, what happened in Srebrenica in Bosnia, to say that there's a lot of similarities between what happened in Rwanda and some of the current genocides over history. And so, in terms of the Holocaust, we do the same thing, frankly, in terms of making sure that we're remembering what happened, keeping those stories alive, making sure that we're capturing the stories of people who had firsthand knowledge of the Holocaust. But it's still pretty heartbreaking when you think about we see the seeds of genocide rearing its head in other country contexts, whether it be the Central African Republic or even some things that have happened in Syria, Yemen. I mean, the stories go on, and we've learned a lot, but we haven't learned enough.
Certainly not soon enough. The other thing that I found in my time in Rwanda and in other African countries is this notion of reconciliation. The fact that you've got perpetrators and victims who are living side by side. Can you talk about that to some degree? I'm specifically thinking of the woman who took a baby and raised it.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's just the story of Grace and Vanessa. So Grace was 10 years old when the genocide started, and, there was killing going on all around her. She, along with many other people, were fleeing. She was with her grandmother, and they were all walking to Congo, to a refugee camp just outside of Goma. And she hears screaming by the side of the road. There's a woman there who's bleeding and dying. There's a baby on her shoulder. And the woman can't talk, but she motions to Grace to come over to her. And her grandmother's like, "Don't do that. It's going to be dangerous for us. Let's keep going." Grace goes over, and she knows that the woman wants her to take the baby. She's 10 years old. Remember that. She doesn't listen to her grandmother. She puts the baby on her back and walks with the baby into Congo. And when they get to the refugee camp, she names the baby Vanessa. So when the genocide is over, they're walking back into Rwanda, and Grace never goes back to school. She's raising Vanessa. She's selling vegetables in the market. And so when Vanessa turns 13, she says, I'm going to tell her the truth. And she said, I was going to be your sister, but I'm also your mother. And if you can understand that, we can live together for a long time.
That was amazing. And for those of you who haven't read the book, it is filled with these stories of the ability of the human spirit to persevere, to rise to the occasion under just unimaginable circumstances.
The amount of courage it took as a 10-year-old to stand up to her grandmother amidst all of that chaos and what was happening, and to have the presence of mind, the audacity to pick up that baby and raise her as her own. I find it astounding and humbling. And I just saw Grace and Vanessa on my last trip to Rwanda, which was amazing.
How are they doing? We need a progress report.
So Grace is married now. She was pregnant with her third child, and Vanessa was in school, and she was working part-time at the Kigali Genocide Memorial.
Awesome. Love hearing that. And then can you talk a little bit about, you touched on it briefly, sort of your philosophy about development, but, what, in your mind, what is the appropriate way that we should be, or not only the U.S., but anybody working in an international development? What's the first thing you should do? You're in country. How do you acclimate? What's your sort of secret sauce in being able to be so effective and impactful in all the places that you've worked, Karen?
First and foremost is just listen. I think you listen. You take your cues and your feedback from people who live in that society. I say that very clearly in Rwanda. I was a guest of the country. I feel that way wherever I'm working. I'm not an Afghan woman. I'm not a South Sudanese woman. I think it does a disservice if I bring my American lens and say this is the way I think development should be done. I think it's actually the opposite of the way development should be done. And I think I've heard over and over from African women saying, people, they would ask them, are you feminists? And, I think feminism, from what I've seen, looks different country to country, woman to woman. And so I think people take issue maybe with the American brand of feminism and what that looks like. But you have to be able to maneuver in a particular country context and a culture that maybe looks and treats people in a different way, with a different approach. And I think that's the nuance, the subtlety that's critical to the way development should be done.
And then the other thing that came through so strongly for me in the book is this sense of forgiveness. And just to see these extraordinary examples of forgiveness and reconciliation. Can you speak to us about that? How did it feel to be there in the first person and experience that with people?
I was truly amazed by some of what women had gone through. There's some additional stories in the book about, you mentioned Christine, who had watched as her husband and 5 children were slaughtered during the genocide. Deborah, who lost her husband and all 6 children during the genocide. And if you think about how does one move past the past, this idea of forgiveness. And the president of Rwanda talks about that, about creating this sense of forgiveness. You can't mandate forgiveness. It's personal. you have to believe it, and you have to forgive the person who has done something to you, which is why in the Rwanda context, the Gacaca courts, where they really had victims confronting the perpetrators and talking to them in a very specific way, because you can't generalize it. And actually the Jewish faith teaches the same thing. Forgiveness is personal. And I think, this was part of my transformation as we were living in Rwanda, but, I don't feel like I had fully forgiven my parents. I think I carried that around, or again, I'm over it. But you think about if a woman can forgive somebody who slaughtered their children, their child during the genocide, how can we not forgive, right?
And, one of the things that I'd like you to also speak to that comes through so beautifully in the book is, people tend to think it's those people, people over there, I'm different, it's not my world. One of the first things you see when you do travel and you're around the world is that we have more in common than we like to think. Can you echo that?
That's probably one of the main reasons I wanted to write this book, was to be able to connect those stories among women. And what I have found is, women basically at their core want the same things. They want to live a life free from violence and abuse and harassment, in peace and with dignity. They want to support and educate their children. They want to believe in a better future. And across continents and cultures, war and peace, what really separates us is this idea of choice, whether it's the simplest expression of our daily preferences to some of the more profound and life-changing choices that shape us as women and mothers and human beings. I have seen that universality across every single country that I've been in.
And as you've had those experiences, can you draw on one or two that made you feel the most hopeful, the most sort of reaffirming about the goodness of people?
I think I love the Euphrasia story. I talked about the beating that that she went through, and this question of choice. But, what I didn't mention is that, she had gone off and she'd started this small business. She started a crafts-based business. She brought all 5 of her children into the trade. She has a couple of stores. And, she took out a loan, she's built a couple of houses, she's renting out the houses to other people. But it's that story of transformation that gives me hope, that somebody who has survived so much has able to rise above those circumstances to not only transform her life herself, but also to give her kids a future. And that makes me hopeful for what's possible. I also feel like, and there's a line in the book that really resonates with me, because I get asked all the time, don't you find it depressing to do this work? Or don't you find it depressing to work with women survivors? And I said, my friend Mukesh Kapila says, cynicism and pessimism are luxuries, only for those who come and go, not who stay and do. And that resonates with me. You're not gonna change everything. You're not gonna make a difference in everybody's life, but you can do what you can to make a difference in somebody's life that in turn can hopefully resonate more broadly.
I'm going to turn back to another question from the audience. They want to know, how old were your sons when you lived in Rwanda? And tell us more about the impact on them on the year that they were there.
So my twins were 14, and my youngest was 11 when we were living there. Yanked him right out of Bethesda, plopped him down into Rwanda.
Adolescence, oh my Lord.
Yep. And so now the twins are 21. Both of them will be graduating from college this year, and my youngest will be graduating from high school. And what I would say is the year that we spent there was pretty life-changing for them. One of the twins is at CU Boulder, studies chemical engineering, and he spent 2 summers in Swaziland building bridges to help isolated communities gain access to healthcare, schools, and markets.
Oh.
And then Eli, the other twin, is at Brandeis, who's majoring in global studies and spent 9 weeks in Rwanda living with me, working with the childhood malnutrition program. And my youngest is actually now doing an internship at the Carter Center in Atlanta with the Center for Civil and Human Rights.
Fantastic. So the sense of community and giving back runs in the family. That's awesome. Awesome. I'm trying to think how I want to say this. So 2 things. I want to know what you want people to take away from the book, but I also want you to talk about what people can do to have an impact locally and globally.
Sure. Just this question that I was bringing up about, voice and choice. There's still so many women around the world who do not have voice and choices around those basic decisions which impact their lives. And so just this recognition that choice is a gift that many women around the world don't share, and it's really a luxury, particularly for women, to be able to choose, and a privilege, I guess. So that's sort of one of the key takeaways. And in terms of what you can do, there's so many different ways to get involved, domestically, internationally, whatever moves you, wherever you find your passion. It doesn't have to be Akilah, Women for Women, or any of the organizations we're talking about here tonight, but they're to find something, a way to contribute, a way to give back. I felt bad because I've spent so much of my career working overseas about issues that are happening right in my community. And so D.C., where I live, in the D.C. area, is one of the most heavily trafficked areas in the United States. Girls in the Washington, D.C. area were being trafficked an average of 5 times a night, 7 days a week. Some of those girls were as young as 9 years old. And that was 20 minutes away from where I lived. And so I got involved with a group called Fair Girls, which was working on trafficking issues in and around that region. So that was how I chose to give back, in addition to, what I was doing with my work. But sometimes that work is 20 minutes away. It's really sort of finding what that means in your community.
And you're right, the trafficking issue is something that's very prominent here in the Bay Area. What's next, Karen?
World domination. Oh.
Yes.
No, Aquila is expanding with Davis College all across East Africa and Asia because of the need for accessible and affordable higher education. I have a strong commitment to that, and particularly to women's education in particular. And so we'll continue to be doing that, but also using my voice to hopefully make changes domestically as well as internationally.
And you'll be an empty nester soon?
I will.
And so what are your plans for that? I see your husband's here in the audience too. Bill?
Maybe take a little bit of downtime and enjoy just having the 2 of us.
Thank you. Well, I think that's all we have time for here today, unless there's anything else that you would like to add about your book tour or your experience in Rwanda?
No, I mean, it's thank you guys for coming and for hearing the story. I hope you enjoy the book. And thank you also for all the incredible work that you're doing. I'm such a huge fan and admirer of Career Girls, and to show these young women a different way and an opportunity is truly inspirational to me.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, Karen. One of the things that when I jumped at the chance when they said, "Would you like to interview and moderate with Karen Sherman?" I was like, "Yes," because I love being able to let people know about these everyday heroes that walk amongst us. And, the work that you've done, the work that you're doing is truly incredible. It's impactful. Just thinking about those 5 children of the mom that's running the business and the impact that, that's going to have in their community. I just think it's wonderful, and it's an honor to be here on the stage with you.
Thank you so much.
So, everyone, please, on behalf of World Affairs, I'd like to ask you to join me in thanking Karen for this excellent discussion, and many thanks to you as well. We got some terrific audience questions, and that's it. Thank you.